So climate experts are urging governments in southern Africa to be more proactive in mitigating severe weather. This week, the South African Weather Service issued several warnings for disruptive weather across the country. The Western Cape experienced disruptive weather conditions, damaging infrastructure, including weather station equipment. So what is the impact of remaining unprepared for disasters, and what measures do governments really need to be putting in place? Well, to discuss this, let's bring in Professor of Climate Change, of Food Systems and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. We are joined now by Professor Tafadzwa Mabaudi. Prof, good morning to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I think I really want to start with the basics, right? It's been a very difficult 3-4 days, certainly for South Africans in parts of the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, KZN, and quite frankly, even in the center parts of the country. How do we know the difference between what is the impacts of climate change and really just bad weather? I think that's a simplistic question, but one we need to answer.
Good morning, Naledi, and thank you very much. Yeah, I agree. It's a very important question to answer. So weather is, the state of conditions at a given place at a given time, and that is over the short term. And what we are experiencing in Cape Town is a system called a cut-off low system. It's a high-pressure system. And this is a weather system that is typical in South Africa during the spring and autumn, and is the similar weather system that resulted in the floods in Durban in April 2022. So the system naturally brings with it rain, thunderstorms, and strong winds. So that's weather. Those are weather systems. Now, climate change, we are looking at the long-term changes in average conditions in a place. And when we talk of climate change, really, it's mostly in the sense that these weather phenomena that have always been there, we are now tending to see an increase in their frequency. So let's say, for example, floods that used to be a 1 in 50 years may go down to 1 in 25 or 1 in 10. The intensity and severity associated with those extremes is then also increasing. And that's mostly the effect of the warming of the atmosphere, which is creating excess energy in the atmosphere, which then sort of supercharges these systems. So climate change is really the long-term aspect. Weather is what we experience on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
The interaction between the two being how then the long-term perspective is changing in terms of the extremes and intensity. Okay.
So what I take then from your discussion, from your point, Prof, is that as a result of us understanding that Africa particularly is massively impacted, particularly sub-Saharan Africa as well, massively impacted by the effects of climate change, that we should be expecting then these very drastic weather patterns that we are seeing. But are our governments showing that they're expectant of them?
So our governments, it's a balance of two things. Our governments are aware that, climate change is happening. They are aware that the likelihood of these events increasing and intensifying is very high. What perhaps they've been slow in doing is putting in place the measures that are needed to mitigate the impacts of these events, so that they don't escalate to become disasters. It's one thing having a hazard, it's another thing when it then escalates into a disaster. That is a human element in between, in terms of how well do we respond, how well were we prepared beforehand. So it's the preparedness element that is lacking.
What does preparedness mean, Prof? Because immediately when you say preparedness, then I think, okay, are we talking about drainage systems and creating halls that are available when we do have flooding perhaps in KZN or heavy rains in Cape Town where we put people? What is preparedness supposed to look like in the best case scenario?
So in the best case scenario, because let's just give an example. We've got this event happening now in Cape Town. You talked about infrastructure being damaged. you talked about weather systems being damaged. You've talked about, we saw that video of the truck being blown over, blown off the road. We've seen flooding happening. ESCOM issued a notice, talking about the electricity infrastructure being under pressure. The health systems are under pressure, and so many interrelated things. So being prepared means basically having an integrated plan at the beginning that says these are all the sectors that are at risk. Now, how do we build preparedness and resilience into these systems? Firstly, you need to increase awareness amongst people so that people are aware of the risk, especially those who are in harm's way, who happen to be located in areas that make them vulnerable, or people who, by virtue of their circumstances, have a high exposure and vulnerability risk. Build awareness, let them know. Make the right interventions in infrastructure to climate-proof it. How do we climate-proof our coastal areas? How do we improve drainage infrastructure? That's one element of it. That is the built infrastructure. How do we rehabilitate the ecological infrastructure so that it plays its natural role? Nature has a role to play in mitigating some of these impacts. How do we develop early warning systems so that people should not have been on the road in those strong winds? They should have been warned to stay off the roads. They should have been warned that there are strong winds approaching. There are these risks associated, and these are the measures for you to take under this kind of risk. So stay off the roads. For example, the South African Weather Service issues what it calls an impact-based warning, which tells you about the likelihood of the event happening as well as the impact associated with it. But it needs to be translated into the languages of the country. It needs to be better communicated to the people so that the person on the ground who is at risk is aware of that. We need to do investments, bring in the finance. The president made an announcement recently that South Africa is setting up a fund for climate change, but we really need to structure that fund in terms of how do we purpose it? What are the different interventions that are needed? Because different areas in the country, the coastal areas, the central areas, they face different risks and they need to be prepared differently. So all of those things, so it's really an integrated plan that needs to be there beforehand, which then outlines how we move towards being a resilient society.
Yeah, but we've been having this discussion for decades, certainly around climate change, and one would hope that even as conversations continue at COP, for instance, that a plan for preparedness is taking place at local levels as well. I'm reading a piece that you wrote, Prof, and this stood out for me. You write that research has also shown that repeated exposure to disasters by some vulnerable communities exposes them to mental health problems such as depression. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because quite often what we do is when we talk about climate change, it seems like a high-level, almost academic discussion, and we don't realize, particularly as South Africans, that these are issues that directly impact us, right? So talk to me about that trickle-down effect that we are probably not getting across to the everyday South African. Ideally, to even put some power back in their hands if possible.
Yeah, definitely. So that was the outcome of research that we did with our colleagues at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And it basically proved what was then hypothetical, to say the fact that the same people get repeatedly affected by these disasters, it puts them in a permanent state of anxiety, depression, and all sorts of other mental health issues. For example, we know that whenever it floods, you will know that the same areas usually get flooded, the informal areas. Now, the impact of waking up and having your home washed away, all your belongings, everything that you've owned and worked for, just washed away, that person is not insured. So no one is going to give them a payout afterwards to restore them to where they were. So they've lost everything. And after the flood, yes, we'll give them some temporary accommodation and what, but that's just it. It's temporary accommodation, some food packages, but we are not restoring them to where they were before the disaster. And as time moves on, everyone else moves on. but the people who've been affected, the people who lost relatives, who lost friends, who lost property, they don't move on quite as easy. And when the next disaster comes back again and hits the very same people, that's what we call repeated exposure. So you've got the same vulnerable people being affected repeatedly. And that has significant implications on their mental health and well-being. You talk now of the drought happening and massive crop failure. Now, what we need to understand is that for some family in the rural area, they were looking forward to eating part of this harvest. They were looking forward to selling some of it and making some money, paying off some debts, paying school fees for children. Now, that whole plan has just gone off the rails. So it means not only are they hungry, they are short of funds. And not only do they now need more money to buy food, they actually have no money because they couldn't sell any surplus. Now they have to make tough decisions in the household.
Right.
Do we buy food? Do we pay school fees? Do we buy medicine? So it has real life implications for ordinary people on the ground who have very low capacity to deal with this sort of impact.
Yeah. I think of, and thank you for that, because what you have done really well is to bring it back home, right? So that we can all understand how we all, in our own individual lives and in our families, can be impacted by the trickle-down effect of climate change events. And unfortunately, Prof, climate change disasters or climate change-linked disasters don't know borders. Right, and you talk about the lack of regional preparedness. Perhaps is there regional synergy, at least, in developing a sort of way to prepare ourselves for disaster when it comes? I think about the effects of a storm hitting Mozambique and how it does eventually lead into parts of South Africa, as an example.
Yeah, so at the regional level, there are synergies, like there's a regional early warning unit, there are regional strategies that say this is how we should do or how we should prepare for disasters. The challenge really is the resourcing. So at the regional level, there is the expression of intent. SADC itself was formed to promote regional integration and cooperation. So that intent is there. The resourcing is what lacks. And the sense of prioritization when member states go back to their households and how they then prioritize their budgets and what to do. So I think that there needs to be an alignment with the realities of what we are facing. There needs to be an alignment, especially in terms of raising finance, because a key challenge really is in a lot of places, people might know what needs to be done, but they do not have the right financial resources or the quantum that is required to make the necessary interventions, as well as the people with the right sort of skills to make those plans and implement them. Yeah.
A plan with preparedness has to have resources, and I think that's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Prof. We really do appreciate it. Professor Tafadzwa Mabaudi, who is a climate change expert, is speaking to us there.